Members of the UN General Assembly vote to reject Russia's annexation of 4 Ukrainian territories that it partially occupies. The EU agrees to start joint gas purchases before next summer, as President Putin blames the energy crisis on the West. Over 2/3 of wild animals have died in the last 50 years, according to the World Wildlife Fund, largely due to habitat destruction.
Territorial integrity of Ukraine.
Members of the UN General Assembly have voted overwhelmingly to condemn Russia's annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions. It's the strongest show of support yet for Ukraine from the UN body, calling on Russia to reverse its actions. 143 countries voted for the measure, with only 5 against amid 35 abstentions.
A UN member state, one with a permanent seat on the Security Council, has attempted to annex territory from its neighbor by force. This UN member state has not only put its neighbor in its crosshairs, but also put a bullseye in this institution's core principle: one country cannot take the territory of another by force.
Despite a major US diplomatic effort to bolster support for the motion, 35 countries, including India and China, abstained. Russia's ambassador to the UN said, "The West is completely deaf to the problems of the global South and calls to finally address them. All efforts are thrown at promoting the Ukrainian narrative, but not for the sake of the country's well-being, only in an attempt to harm Russia." Last month, Russia formally announced the annexation of 4 partially occupied provinces of eastern and southern Ukraine. Voters in Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia had, according to Moscow, overwhelmingly backed joining Russia, but Kyiv and its Western allies rejected the referendums as meaningless and illegal.
Opening the second day of the defense ministers' meeting here in NATO in Brussels, the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, and the United States Defense Secretary welcomed the United Nations vote of condemning Russia's illegal so-called referendums in Ukraine and demanded that Moscow reverses that. At the same time, NATO allies say that they will keep the course of supporting Kiev militarily, and they will discuss of how they can provide them with more air defense systems. But at the same time, many members of NATO say that they are very much worried that they won't be able to keep that pledge, because they will have their own stockpiles empty at home and they will stay unprotected. But NATO are going to discuss also this, how they will replenish their own stockpiles as soon as possible. Efi Koutsakosta from Brussels, NATO.
Energy ministers of the European Union have reached a general consensus to start joint gas purchases before summer 2023. At their meeting in Prague, EU Energy Commissioner Kadri Simpson said gas prices remain unstable and more measures to alleviate the crisis, including the need to further reduce gas consumption, were needed.
The Russian pipeline flows have dropped under 10%, and attacks on EU's energy infrastructure increase the uncertainty further. This is why the Commission is working to present a package of proposals on the 18th of October, and it will not be the last such package, as we must continue to develop our tools and adjust our approach as the situation develops.
Earlier, at an energy forum in Moscow, Russian President Vladimir Putin claimed his country was a reliable energy supplier and blames the West for disruption to the energy market. It's in the EU's court to resolve the crisis, he said.
The gas bills have more than tripled in a year. Their population, as in the Middle Ages, began to stock up on firewood for the winter. What does Russia have to do with it? And they are constantly trying to blame their own mistakes on someone, in this case on Russia. It's your own fault.
Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, EU nations have been making efforts to use less Russian energy, as Moscow is using the revenues to fund its war. Together with steep cuts in supplies from Russia, the 27-nation bloc is reeling from gas prices almost 90% higher than a year ago.
Neutral Austria is seeking closer cooperation with the other non-aligned EU countries, Cyprus, Ireland and Malta. Alongside her Cypriot counterpart, Austria's Defense Minister Claudia Tanner spoke of a common security and defense policy. In view of Scandinavian accessions to NATO, the number of neutral EU members is shrinking. Nonetheless, the latter could play a special role in the Ukraine war, Tanner said.
It's very important that we coordinate more closely with the neutral countries or those that don't belong to an alliance like NATO. Why? Maybe it's also an opportunity, when the time comes, to offer a stage for diplomatic opportunities at some point, not at the present time, but at some point this day will come.
Moscow has recently rejected an Austrian mediation role between Russia and Ukraine. By going along with the anti-Russian sanctions, the Alpine Republic has been too pro-Western, the Kremlin said. Nevertheless, Austria now has a unique position in the EU, says neutrality expert Heinz Gärtner, because all other non-aligned EU countries have at least bilateral military relations.
Austria is in fact the only neutral state that can maintain ties with the non-aligned global south and also play a special role as host to international organizations.
However, it is undisputed that at the moment Austria cannot defend its neutral territory. Far too few soldiers, insufficient training. Minister Tanner counts on soldiers voluntarily prolonging their basic military training to 9 months.
Hundreds of young men have voluntarily committed themselves to stay with the Austrian armed forces 3 months longer, some even beyond. We'll continue to work on that.
Originally, Austria's army budget should have been almost doubled next year. Instead, much less money will be spent on artillery and equipment. Only in the following years will the budget to grow to 1.5% of GDP. Johannes Bleschberger, Euronews, Vienna.
Over 2/3 of all wild animals have died in the last 50 years, according to the World Wildlife Fund. It's an astonishingly fast rate, one that has also led to the extinction of countless mammals, birds, fish and other creatures. Latin America, with its large forests, has been hit the hardest.
The decline is global, but there are some regions that are affected much more heavily. 94% decline in the Latin American continent. This is not totally surprising because the continent contains tropical regions today contains so much more biodiversity. So it's obvious that the decline is therefore stronger, higher in those regions compared to Europe, where we have recorded a 15% decline. But the reason is that Europe has lost its wildlife much before.
The destruction of wild habitats is a big factor. It's estimated that 17% of virgin forest has been lost in the last 50 years.
We got to abandon this delusional idea that we can continue to take nature for granted. We can continue to develop ourselves wastefully, destructively, without taking into account the consequences of environmental degradation. There are consequences. And if we don't change course and become carbon neutral on one hand for climate and nature positive in terms of biodiversity, we will pay even more consequences and the price will be even higher in the years to come.
Worryingly for animals, if the world warms by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, climate change will start to dominate as a reason for wild animal death and extinction.
Conspiracy theorist Alex Jones has been ordered to pay more than €964 million to people who suffered from his false claim that the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting in 2012 was a hoax. The families of 8 victims and an FBI agent who responded to the attack alleged the right-wing radio host's misinformation led to a decade of harassment and death threats. A city in southern Pakistan is still underwater 42 days after torrential rainfall. Kaipur Nathan Shah is home to 41,000 residents. 2 weeks ago, the whole place was submerged. But with no sewers, water takes time to recede. Life is slowly coming back to normal on the outskirts, but lack of food and poor sanitation remain major concerns.